Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to today's webinar, which will provide you with more information on endpoint assessment and also WAMITAB's plans to offer endpoint assessment. I'm Karen Slade, for those of you who don't know me.
And I'm Chris James, for those of you who don't know me or do know me.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Okay, so just before we get going, I just want to go over a few housekeeping rules. Firstly, I've muted everybody, so if you could please not unmute yourself, it just helps to eliminate any background noise throughout the webinar. If you have any questions, then please pop them in the chat box and we will have a look at them at the end. Feel free to pop them in as we go along and then we'll review them at the end, but please do not unmute yourself or we'll have all sorts of feedback. I have also pressed the record button on today's webinar, so it will be available for reviewing at a later date should you need it. So I'm just going to have a quick look at what we're hoping to cover in today's webinar. So I will pass it over to Chris in a moment, who will give you an overview of where we are at the moment with apprenticeship. We'll have a very brief look at the Trailblazer Apprenticeship. We'll then have a look at the endpoint assessment journey in a little bit more detail. We will then talk to you about WAMITAB Assessment, the endpoint assessment organisation from WAMITAB. We'll have a look at some standards. We'll then look at assessors and IQAs. We'll look at the next steps and then we'll take your questions. So I'm just going to pop you over to Chris now, who will do his CEO welcome.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I think that many of you will want to know precisely where we are with the apprenticeship, its development, and how things are moving along. Well, the current position, in truth, has changed. Each day we submit to the department or to Ofqual for recognition, we get feedback, and as we go through, we get more detail about what they expect from us, about what they want the assessment structure to be, the content of it, and so on and so forth. And I'll give you some insights into where we are with that shortly. So the current position, there are, as you are aware, a number of apprenticeships to which WAMITAB subscribes by virtue of its position within the marketplace. Part of that is in relation to the car parking, which we know won't impact on many of you, and that one is still very much in consideration. There is an apprenticeship currently nearing completion on safety, health and the environment, and that standard is nearing completion. That's at level 3. The level 2 waste management apprenticeship has been submitted. We are currently looking at the assessment strategy again, and hopefully we'll be able to give you a little bit more detail on that. In terms of the estimated date to go live, very difficult to say, simply because the last phase is the assessment strategy, and it's as quickly as we can provide a meaningful response to the departments and Ofqual in terms of the questions that they've asked. For example, at the present time, the thinking for the assessment strategy was on the lines of it being 2 parts. Those 2 parts are, one is an observation of the candidate undertaking their job, and the regulators have come back to us and said, in respect of that part of the assessment, do you expect it to be part of a normal day? Or would you expect it to be set tasks which have been set up and are assessed? And in truth, of course, the two are quite differently perceived. If it is their normal working day, effectively you would go along and you would assess them in part of their normal working day, but you may not see the skills during that time that you want to see. The alternative, of course, is then to set up some particular assessment tasks which the candidates undertake, and that gives us greater control. So those are some of the questions that we're looking at. They've come back also and said, for an industry upon which health and safety is so important, we would recommend that you include a greater attention to the assessment of health and safety, specifically within the assessment plans. We're also looking at the professional discussions and whether or not a professional discussion or question and answer is more applicable. That would be the second part of the assessment. So one part is going to be the skills assessment, the second part being the professional discussion. And again, the question is really how much we want to have it as a discussion, or simply 20 questions which are randomly selected, which are relevant to their portfolio, and which we then ask the candidates in turn. So we really need to bottom out those kind of issues more specifically. They also came back with some issues over can we be more specific about how a grade is achieved. And I think that more or less, we've reached the conclusion that for endpoint assessment, it will be a pass or a distinction, that we probably wouldn't want to go for a middle grade for a number of reasons, but pass and distinction are where we are. Going back then to estimated go live, with a following wind, June, July 2018, projected number of learners, difficult to say. And it really, at this stage, depends on obviously which people, how many take it up. We anticipated initially around about 750 candidates to take it in the first year. That was then revised back to 400, but I would imagine somewhere between that would be realistic. We are expecting that in terms of the endpoint assessment itself, that new conditions, those are conditions of recognition for the endpoint assessment organization to be introduced, which are more applicable to the work that the endpoint assessment does. At the moment, they are really only in discussion phase, and we will give you an update on them as they impact on us or as they'll impact on anything that you're doing. One of the other points is whether or not a qualification could be embedded within an apprenticeship. And I think that it would be fair to say that there are schools of thought on both sides, those who say quite heavily that why not if you can? And that has been in some ways backed by a government move. Government originally set out their stall which said that an apprenticeship was set on the standard, qualifications cannot and should not be embedded or cannot be part of them. They've kind of moved their thinking a little now, and they're saying that for some qualifications, that for some apprenticeships, a qualification could or even should be embedded within the apprenticeship. The Waste Management Group therefore went back and said, okay, what kind of qualification can be embedded? And they said, well, it can only be theory. So if it's a principal's qualification, a theoretical qualification, then that could be embedded. So WAMITAB, in partnership or with the Trailblazer group led by Veolia, submitted a proposal in which we would put the principles of sustainable resource management. That was initially accepted, and they said, well, what we suggest is that you, for the moment, you put it to one side and we'll include it at a later stage if it's considered to be viable. And the reason they asked us to put it so this change in policy by government is so new that putting it in at this stage may not have been filtered through to all of the government departments who consider your application. So probably look at it later on. So the ambition, therefore, is potentially to go with an apprenticeship based on the standard, but with the potential for putting a qualification within it before we finally submit. And that would mean that the principles of sustainable resource management could be a qualification which is assessed in the normal way through the normal awarding organisation structure, alongside and as part of the apprenticeship. So really that concludes, in one sense, my overview of the apprenticeship system as we are. No doubt there are some questions, but for the time being, I shall hand over back to Karen.
That's great, thanks, Chris. Okay, so I'm going to touch very, very briefly on the changes that's happened to apprenticeships, because I'm sure that this is a widely touched upon subject of which a lot of you will know quite a lot about. This is quite a good image which just shows the change from the SAFE framework to the Trailblazer apprenticeship. The biggest difference being the removal of the mandatory qualification and the introduction of the gateway and the endpoint assessment. It just helps to make the whole process more robust and more credible. So some of you might be thinking, why have they put endpoint assessment in? It's just the point of making the whole process more credible, and it will fit around the similar sort of endpoint examinations, such as, you know, people go through the GCSEs, A levels. It's just that endpoint assessment to test everything that the apprentices learned while they're on programme. And it's just seen to be more valuable and as a real alternative to going to college to do A levels or potentially doing a degree. The new apprenticeships are supported by the newly formed Education and Skills Funding Agency. There's also newly formed Institute for Apprenticeships, and obviously regulated by Ofsted. The pivotal point for the new Trailblazer apprenticeships, and where the Endpoint Assessment Organisation, which is obviously the focus of today's webinar, would start their involvement, is at something called the gateway. So you'd have your on-programme elements, you'd have the gateway, and then you'd have the endpoint assessment. So the gateway is the element which the training provider, the employer, and the apprentice will have agreed that the apprentice is deemed fully competent to the standard and can now progress onto the final assessment stage. This would be determined by some form of review of the apprentice's work, or perhaps an interview. Once this happens, the independent endpoint assessment organisation would be notified, and the apprentice would be then taken through the gateway. The endpoint assessment organisation has to then progress them onto the endpoint assessment. The endpoint assessment organisation will be decided upon very early on in the process. I think it's something like within 4 weeks of the apprentice going on programme, they have to notify the ESFA of who will be used. So the endpoint assessment can cost up to 20% of the funding cap, and this will be determined to each individual standard. We just have a look at the different types of assessment you could come across. This list here is not all of them. It's just the types that we might come across within this sector. So we'd have the observation or practical assessment, questioning or testing, a professional discussion, and potentially a learning log or portfolio that would be reviewed. Each type of assessment will have a weighting towards the final grade, and every standard is different, as I've said. So every assessment plan will ask for a different mixture of testing methods for endpoint assessment. It is possible to pass some elements and fail others, but if this happens, the assessment plan will determine if the apprentice has to resit every element, or whether or not they need to only resit the part that they didn't pass. This is changing quite a bit. Initially, it was fail one or fail them all, which seems ridiculous on all kinds of levels. So I think people are learning by their mistakes and realising actually that's probably not the best way to go. Generally, I would say that resits will probably be chargeable unless it's negotiated into the contract to begin with, but all that would be agreed with well in advance.
If I just interject for a second there, when we put forward the provision or the guide, we were discussing whether or not the candidates should have one reassessment or two if they failed. And for the time being, the proposal is that they have potentially two reassessments.
Okay. So as I mentioned, each standard will have a different endpoint assessment, and the methods they use will be different. Some might just have two, like the LGV driver standard that I've popped on the screen here, but some could have 4 elements. I know that some of the operational departmental managers have got quite big endpoint assessments. And as I said, each element will have an overall weighting towards the end result. Every element will have a pass mark, and then every element must be achieved in order to pass the endpoint assessment. So you can see it kind of builds up into this overall pass and then grade. So if we just have a look at the example on the screen, which is the light goods vehicle driver standard, we can see that as well as the minimum of 12 months on programme, which is prior to the gateway, so that's the part that's spent with the training provider, the apprentice must complete the Cat C licence, and that must be completed prior to the gateway. So any apprenticeship standard that has a mandatory qualification, not all of them do, that would have to be completed before gateway, and that will be part of the gateway process that's ticked off the list. It's also worth noting that the apprentice will have had to have achieved the relevant numeracy or literacy certification prior to the gateway. So again, that would be another thing that will be checked. That could be in the forms of exemption through GCSE or A levels, or it could be a functional skills certificate at the right level, and that may have been taken whilst on programme or could have been achieved previously. So then you get to the gateway, and after the gateway, the apprentice will undertake a short question and answer, and then a scenario test. So in order to pass that, they must gain 70%. Then they will need to undertake a practical driving test, and then this is just in addition to the Cat C licence that they would have taken. And if they don't achieve this practical driving test, that doesn't affect their Cat C licence. It's just part of the endpoint assessment, and it means that they won't have achieved their full apprenticeship. And you can see on here that it's there's two different gradings for this standard. So you've got a pass, which is 70%, and then to pass with a distinction, you would need to get 90%, and that would need to be on both elements of your endpoint assessment. So sort of going on from the pass and the distinction, some standards will have a pass, merit or distinction, and again, every standard is different, and each Trailblazer group has to decide how they're going to give a grade, the weighting, and then they will given specifically a pass, merit or distinction. The SACE framework didn't have a pass, merit or distinction, and I know that I used to constantly get asked, how could someone prove that they passed with a distinction when their file was perhaps exceptional in relation to somebody else who had put the bare minimum in. So from an employer's perspective, to be able to note that an apprentice has passed their apprenticeship with a distinction, obviously it just shows that they're working at a much higher level. So it's WAMITAB's intention to apply to become an endpoint assessment organisation. Our aim is to support the sector to invest in the development of fresh talent by offering endpoint assessment solutions to employers. Chris has already outlined the timescales we are working with for our first standard. Now, I've just popped together some standards that we are potentially looking at for the future. So Chris has already talked about the waste and resource operative, hoping for approval for that in the summer, with metal and recycling operative, fingers crossed, shortly after. We've already touched upon the LGV. We've also got the facilities management supervisor. So both the LGV and the facilities management supervisor are already approved for delivery. We may be looking at submission onto the register at a later date for these. I've just added the SHE technician as well, which is the safety, health and environmental technician at level 3. That has very, very recently been approved. And again, that's something that we're looking to potentially offer in the future. So if you're a training provider who's joined us today, or indeed an employer, and you're intending to offer apprenticeships in any of the above standards, or indeed anything else, get in contact with us and let us know what your plans are, because we'd love to be able to support you in any way possible. So once an organisation is accepted onto the register to deliver endpoint assessment, they must agree to the conditions of acceptance. And although an organisation must make a separate submission every single time they want to assess a different endpoint assessment standard, they only need to return these conditions once, but they're quite strict, and we need to make sure that we're compliant to them in all ways. It's a very strict code of practice for the endpoint assessment organisations, and we really must adhere to them, and in turn make sure that anyone that we deal with, we operate with, that works for us, sticks to them as well. And it's all about just protecting the integrity of these new standards. So I've just put together some of the key conditions, and I'm not going to go through them all because there were quite a few key conditions. So just sort of having a look at some of them. We must not promote our EPA services as part of the package or service offered by an apprenticeship provider. So what that means is that the employer is supposed to appoint the endpoint assessment organisation. So what we're not looking to do is promote any of our additional services that WAMITAB offers as an awarding organisation. We're not looking to form partnerships with any training providers because that's against our conditions, not that we're an endpoint assessment organisation yet. So whilst we want to share knowledge and whatnot, we can't be seen to be going into business with people for benefit. What we can do is offer on-programme support to providers, so potentially offer an insight into what the endpoint assessment might be. So that's allowed, but we just have to make sure that everything's very clear and separate. One of the key conditions for endpoint assessment organisations is that they shouldn't have had any contact or shouldn't have been involved in any of the training elements of the apprentice while on programme. So one of the things that is very common within the WAMITAB network is that peripatetic assessors work for a number of centres. Now, we just need to be very careful that anybody that works with WAMITAB Endpoint Assessment isn't involved with the training provider that is providing the on-programme elements. So we have to have quite a robust conflict of interest policy in place for that. It is worth noting at this point that each assessment plan will identify which organisation will carry out the external quality assurance for the standard. This could be relevant. This could be a relevant professional body. It could be the Institute for Apprentices, or it could be Ofqual. If it's Ofqual, then the endpoint assessment organisation needs to be recognised by them under general terms of recognition. So essentially, they would need to be an awarding organisation. So that could discount many smaller endpoint assessment organisations that don't have that recognition. WAMITAB Endpoint Assessment would like to hear from any assessors or quality assurers that would like to work with us in the development and the assessment of identified standards. Initially, we are looking for assessors and IQAs who would operate in the waste and resource sector. Just to go over the type of development work that could be involved, so obviously we need to develop the endpoint assessment questions, the tasks, which we'll obviously know more of once we have an approved assessment plan. So the development work could be contributing to the development of a question bank. It could be contributing to devising assessment scenarios or activities. It could be auditing instructional resources or assessment activities and scenarios. It could also be carrying out mock assessment activities prior to us going live with apprentices, just to make sure that the processes work. Then when we would be looking at endpoint assessments, the activities could be things like conducting a pre-assessment site visit to the apprentice. So that's basically just making sure that we're happy that the site is ready for us to go in and do endpoint assessment. It could be conducting an observation on an apprentice. which most of you who are assessing will be used to. It could be conducting review of a learning log or portfolio of evidence. So that would mean that that would be done prior to any involvement with the apprentice, and it wouldn't necessarily be assessed, but it would be it would influence a later assessment. There could be a situation where you might devise apprentice-specific questions as a result of looking at a learning log. And you could be conducting question and answer or professional discussion with an apprentice. So fairly standard stuff that people who've been assessing for a while have probably already undertaken. So if you are working with this as an IQA, the activities could be quality assuring assessment activities or scenarios prior to going live with apprentices, conducting site visits, so similar now as you would conduct site visits, and devising and carrying out standardisation activities. Because of the strict conflict of interest potential within our sector, we've put together a list of essential requirements for anybody who is looking to work with WAMITAB assessment. So be looking for somebody with industry experience. They need to have up-to-date certification, licenses or continued competences where relevant. Or their CPD would need to be up-to-date and it would need to be evidenced. They'd be able to accept work on a self-employed or peripatetic basis. They would need to be a qualified assessor or qualified quality assurer. There is potential for development in that area for really strong candidates who've got a really strong occupational background. They need to have up-to-date knowledge of occupational standards within our sector. They need to be comfortable with the use of technology to conduct assessments. They need to have a lot of professional integrity, and they need to have the willingness to attend standardisation and training events. So if you'd like to be considered for an assessment or IQA position with WAMITAB assessments, then in the first instance, if you were to send me an email at the email on the screen, or you can drop us a line on the mobile number on the screen, then we can just have an informal chat. I think we're going to go to questions now. So I'll give you an opportunity to pop questions in the chat box now, and I'll just pass back over to Chris, who we'll just summarise what we've been over today.
Well, thank you very much, Karen, and well done. I hope you will appreciate Karen's contribution. The apprenticeship, therefore, is in truth an evolving structure, and the apprenticeship, as it was envisaged probably 2 and 3 years ago, has changed and no doubt will continue to change. At the present time, the levy, which is payable in England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales, can only be used on apprenticeships in England, but at the present time, the use of the levy in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland is also a good point. And how is it going to be used? And I suspect that they will be opening the doors for bids against the levy in order to be able to deliver. And I know that's going to be the case in Wales, and we're meeting with Welsh Government in the near future to discuss that. So far as the apprenticeship and the embedding of qualifications, we're getting increasing indication from government that a knowledge-based test of some form should be part of the endpoint assessment. And we think that the practical skills, the principles of resource management is a good qualification to embed. We will be going on to, as I'm sure you're aware, the level 4, and WAMITAB has had early discussions with the Trailblazer group to start to look at the development of the level 4 apprenticeship. For those of you who are aware of the SOM, the Systems Operations Management apprenticeship at level 4, it has been initially proposed as a basis for the level 4 apprenticeship. There has been consideration of whether or not WAMITAB could or should embed statutory qualifications within the level 4, and that remains a question. The reason why it remains a question is because by embedding a qualification within an apprenticeship, it then becomes available to any awarding organisation. And for a number of reasons, WAMITAB would therefore be cautious about this approach. However, we have agreed that we will be embedding some of the level 4 units in it as we go forward. Karen has covered off some of the key issues regarding the apprenticeship, whether or not it's going to be pass or merit, the requirements of assessment. Just one thing I would add is that people who have got an existing assessment qualification, be it the D32, D33 if you're old, like me, or whether it's Tarka or Carver or Kettles, Petals, Freckles or whatever they are, then please be aware that the nature of the assessment for endpoint assessment is a modification of that, and any assessor would need to be re-updated and probably called into WAMITAB to be made aware of what those specific differences are and what we would our expectation of those assessors, because there are some differences which are apparent from the endpoint assessment.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Well, I've had absolutely no questions, which I'm very short about, but that means that we don't get put in the hot seat, Chris, so that's quite a good thing. I'm assuming, because I've had none through on the chat function, that nobody has any. Obviously, if you log off from here and think of something, then please just drop either myself or you can always speak to Chris. But if you probably come to me in the first instance, and we'll see if we can help you. And obviously, like I said, if anybody has any interest in working with us on the endpoint assessment development, if you drop me a line and we can go from there. Let me just take this opportunity to thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future.